What if I told you that one of the poorest countries in Africa, a nation once mocked as landlocked, unstable, ungovernable, just paid off nearly $5 billion in debt, without a single loan from the IMF, the World Bank, or Washington? Would you believe me? Would you want to? Because Burkina Faso, a name rarely heard in Western media unless tragedy strikes, just did the unthinkable. It stood up not with weapons or slogans, but with numbers, with spreadsheets, with policy, with its own people's trust. And at the center of it all is a 36-year-old soldier named Ibrahim Traoré. No Goldman Sachs degree, no photo ops with G7 leaders. Just one conviction that dignity isn't something you borrow. It's something you build. And when the IMF didn't clap, when the World Bank didn't send congratulations, that silence was the real headline. Because when the colonized stop asking for permission, the empire starts to sweat. If you still believe in justice, not just for one nation, but for all, hit subscribe. Because what you're about to hear won't make it onto the evening news. But it just might rewrite history. Long before the headlines, long before the protests, and long before Ibrahim Traoré ever wore a uniform. Africa's fate was written in contracts, not chains. After independence, African nations didn't get a clean break. They got offers, loans, packages, promises. The names sounded helpful. Structural adjustment programs, development finance, technical assistance, but in reality, these were weapons, quiet ones, dressed in pinstripes, not camouflage, delivered through boardrooms, not battlefields. And when the leaders of Ghana, Zambia, and Nigeria signed those deals, they weren't just borrowing money. They were surrendering policy. Prices of bread fuel education dictated by economists in Washington. National budgets reviewed not by citizens, but by consultants from Paris. And when conditions failed, when riots erupted over tuition hikes and fuel subsidies, the lenders didn't take the blame. The governments did. It wasn't aid. It was entrapment. By the 1990s, Africa owed more in interest payments than it received in actual development aid. And still the debt kept growing. Leaders changed, currencies collapsed, and through it all the lenders remained, smiling, waiting. And then came Burkina Faso, a country with no port, no oil boom, no Ivy League-trained finance minister, just one young captain who said, "We do not need loan conditions. We need living conditions." That phrase broke the spell, because it reminded millions that the leash of dependency was never fate. It was design. What Traoré did wasn't just new. It was a return to something ancient, the belief that no nation needs to apologize for standing on its own. So when Burkina Faso chose to pay its debt without begging, it wasn't just an accounting decision. It was an act of memory, and it cracked a story the West had been telling for 60 years. In early 2024, while financial analysts in New York and Brussels debated interest rates and forecast models, a quiet revolution was unfolding in a place they never thought to watch, Burkina Faso. There were no press conferences, no red carpets, just a straightforward declaration by Prime Minister Apollinaire Guillaume de Tambela. We have cleared our domestic debt, $479 billion. No IMF, no World Bank, no Western oversight. For many in the room, the words didn't land at first. It wasn't the size of the number that shocked them, it was who said it, and how. Burkina Faso had been written off by global markets as fragile, unstable, and too dependent to survive. Western commentators called it a failed state in the making. Sanctions were in place, aid had been cut, and yet somehow, this landlocked nation had not only survived, it had done what even middle-income countries often fail to do, paid its debt with no foreign help. How that story begins, not in the capital markets of London, but in the dusty fields of Ouahigouya, in the crowded markets of Bobo-Dioulasso, and in the resilience of a people who had grown tired of waiting for help that never truly came. President Ibrahim Traoré knew what he was up against. with sanctions tightening and security threats looming. Most leaders would have called the IMF, held emergency talks, begged for loans. He did the opposite. He turned to the one resource the West always underestimates: his own people. The Traoré administration made a choice that defied every orthodox manual on global finance. Instead of chasing capital from overseas, they looked inward. They issued domestic bonds, not to Wall Street, but to Burkina Banks pension funds, cooperatives, and even individuals. At first, many thought it was madness. Who's going to invest in a country at war with itself, they asked. But the answer came not from foreign analysts, but from ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and school teachers who said we will. They didn't just buy bonds. They bought ownership. Ownership of a future that wasn't scripted in Washington or measured by credit ratings. And the government met them halfway. For the first time in decades, people saw transparency. Monthly reports, budget breakdowns, town hall forums explaining where each dollar would go and how. Schools, clinics, irrigation canals, not IMF-mandated austerity, but targeted investment. This wasn't just good governance, it was emotional repair. Because for generations, the people of Burkina Faso had watched as money came in and disappeared, watched as ministers shook hands in foreign capitals while schools back home collapsed from mold and neglect, watched as reform always meant job cuts, subsidy removals, and longer lines at the clinic. But this time, things were different. Traoré didn't speak to financiers first. He spoke to veterans, to single mothers, to students. And he asked not for sacrifice, but for trust. He told them, "We will not eat loans today and starve tomorrow. We will plant, we will build, and we will own the fruit of our labor." Those words weren't campaign slogans, they were contracts. Across the country, civil servants bought bonds from their savings. Cooperatives pooled funds to invest. Even young entrepreneurs barely out of university put in small amounts, not out of greed, but faith. That's the part the economists missed. This wasn't about yield, it was about belief. What Wall Street calls risk appetite, Burkina citizens called hope. Meanwhile, international markets waited for the collapse. They expected hyperinflation, capital flight, bank failures. None of it came. Instead, the opposite happened. Burkina Faso's inflation rate dropped. The local currency gained trust, especially in rural areas. And small businesses, instead of fleeing, reinvested in roads and markets, in logistics chains. Not because they were told to, because now their success wasn't dependent on a minister abroad, but on neighbors they could look in the eye. Behind closed doors in Washington, alarm bells rang. Because what Burkina Faso had done wasn't just a fiscal stunt. It was an act of ideological disobedience. By refusing the IMF's life raft, they had exposed the illusion that poor countries can only survive on loans. That sovereignty is only symbolic. That dignity has a price tag. But Ibrahim Traoré set the price himself. And he paid it with courage. The bond market didn't collapse. The banks didn't run. The people didn't riot. Because this wasn't just economic policy. It was a spiritual shift. It said, we will no longer ask for permission to survive. We will no longer kneel to those who measure us only in deficits. We will no longer sell our tomorrow for comfort today. Burkina Faso didn't defeat the IMF with speeches. It did it with discipline, with transparency, and with a kind of quiet audacity that speaks louder than any megaphone. And now the world is watching, not to see if they survive, but to see who follows next. It wasn't the payment that shook them. It was the silence that followed. When Burkina Faso announced it had cleared $4.79 billion in domestic debt, with no help from the IMF, the World Bank, or Western donors, there was no press release from Washington, no congratulatory tweet from Paris, no editorial praise from the Financial Times. Instead, there was a pause, a deep, uneasy pause. And behind that silence, panic. Because if Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation under sanctions with no oil windfall, no tourist economy could fund its own recovery, then what exactly had the West been selling to Africa for 60 years? The truth is simple. Burkina Faso didn't just pay a bill, it broke an unspoken rule. Don't prove the system is unnecessary. Don't show the others that survival is possible without foreign oversight. Don't inspire copycats. But that's exactly what Ibrahim Traoré did. And the world took notice not with applause, but with pressure. Within weeks of the announcement, IMF representatives held quiet meetings with officials in Mali and Niger, warning of fiscal irresponsibility. Donor countries reviewed aid packages. Economic forums suddenly lost Burkina Faso's invitation. Think tanks in Brussels labeled the model unsustainable populism. Then came the narrative shift. Where once Western media cautiously covered Traoré's rise, now they questioned his motives. Headlines began using words like radical militarized governance, shadow influence. Some even floated unsubstantiated claims of Russian or Chinese backing, not because there was evidence, but because the success had to be explained away. Surely they didn't do this alone, they whispered. There must be a puppet master behind the curtain. But the most threatening thing about Burkina Faso's achievement wasn't geopolitical. It was philosophical. For decades, the development industry pushed one message: Africa needs help. That message came with strings tied to trade debt diplomacy. The IMF didn't just lend money, it set rules. The World Bank didn't just fund schools, it chose the curriculum. And for a long time, most African leaders, desperate cornered, played along. Some reluctantly, some willingly, some out of habit. But Traoré wasn't interested in playing. He was interested in rewriting. He never shouted. He didn't stage photo ops. He simply governed, accountably, transparently, and most of all, locally. That's what scared them most. Because if this model spread, if Ghana, Nigeria, or Kenya decided to do the same, the entire foundation of Western influence in Africa would begin to crack. The leverage of loans, the control of conditions, the moral authority of being the helper, gone. And so the retaliation began. Burkina Faso faced renewed sanctions, travel restrictions, and media blackout. International aid groups pulled out quietly. Western embassies warned investors. One European diplomat was overheard saying, "We can't let this become the model." But it was already too late. Burkina Faso's story had crossed borders, not through embassies or news channels, but through memory. Through WhatsApp groups, diaspora circles, and underground podcasts. Through students in Lagos quoting Traoré's budget plans. Through African American professors comparing his defiance to the Black Panthers' community programs. Even Latin America paid attention. In Bolivia, economists held panels titled The Sahel Model. In Argentina, youth leaders asked, "What if we stop borrowing altogether?" And inside Africa, the murmurs grew louder. Mali called Traoré's debt clearance an act of courage. Niger said it would study the Burkina model. Ghanaian opposition leaders asked why their country, rich in gold and cocoa, still owed billions to foreign lenders. The walls were shaking, and the West could feel it. Washington responded not publicly, but quietly. Analysts at Brookings and the Council on Foreign Relations began drafting reports with titles like The Sahel Gambit and When Sovereignty Disrupts Development. Internal memos floated through State Department offices with a haunting refrain. What if they no longer need us? That question wasn't born of arrogance. It was born of history. Because deep down, every architect of the global order knew that its power didn't rest on guns or armies anymore. It rested on dependency, on the myth that survival without the West was impossible. Burkina Faso shattered that myth, not with ideology, not with protest, but with receipts, with numbers. And now the keepers of the old world had a choice: adapt or lose relevance, because Ibrahim Traoré had done what Cold War-era coups, armed rebellions, and global summits had failed to do. He made freedom work. And as Burkina Faso's markets stabilized as bond sales exceeded expectations, and as youth unemployment fell, the silence in Western capitals turned from caution to alarm. Because the world wasn't just watching anymore, it was listening. And what it heard from Ouagadougou was simple, powerful, and impossible to ignore. We do not ask for permission to be free. We rise and claim it. Would you like to proceed with Section 5, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, who's next? The dust had barely settled in Ouagadougou when the first tremors rippled across the continent. In Mali, government ministers held a closed-door session to study Burkina Faso's financial strategy. No IMF observers were invited. In Niger, military leaders declared in public speeches that sovereignty begins with the economy. And in Nigeria, economists on late-night shows, once loyal to Bretton Woods orthodoxy, began asking dangerous questions. If Burkina Faso can do it, why can't we? This wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror, a reflection of decades of frustration suddenly shattered by a single act of defiance that worked. And the youth noticed first. From TikTok live streams in Accra to Telegram channels in Addis Ababa, young Africans began reposting Ibrahim Traoré's speeches, quoting him like an anti-colonial prophet. Not for what he wore, not for his military title, but because he made something real happen without asking permission. In student unions across Ghana, in Pan-African policy forums in Senegal, in think tanks run by the diaspora from Minneapolis to Johannesburg, the question gained volume. Is this the beginning of Africa's economic second independence? Because something had shifted. For too long, sovereignty in Africa meant flag-waving ceremonies and national anthems, penned in the languages of former colonizers. But beneath those flags, the budgets were still written elsewhere. The contracts still required overseas approval, and the growth plans still relied on debt dressed as aid. But now there was proof, not just theory, that another way existed. In Kenya, a coalition of economists, activists, and clergy drafted a public letter to the president urging him to study the Burkina Faso strategy. In Ethiopia, a coalition of small businesses offered to co-finance domestic bonds, a direct nod to Traoré's model of citizen trust financing development. Even in South Africa, where economic policy has long been a battleground between liberation ideals and neoliberal pressures, the opposition began invoking Burkina Faso as a symbol of what honest, accountable sovereignty could look like. Across borders and political systems, the question was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. Because the logic of the IMF that poor countries must borrow, cut, privatize, and repeat was cracking. And Burkina Faso, through sheer will and collective sacrifice, had walked out of the loop. But not everyone welcomed the wave. In Côte d'Ivoire, the finance ministry issued a memo urging civil servants to maintain stability through proven channels, a veiled reference to the IMF. In Rwanda, state media ran a subtle critique of unsupervised debt experimentation, targeting Traoré's model without naming it. The old guard technocrats trained in European business schools saw the danger, not in numbers, but in narrative. Because this wasn't about fiscal charts, it was about memory. Burkina Faso's story tapped into something deeper than macroeconomics. It awakened the long-suppressed dreams of Thomas Sankara Patrice Lumumba Kwame Nkrumah, men who believed that Africa could define its own future not through aid, but through audacity. And it showed that sovereignty wasn't an abstract concept. It was measurable. In bond rates, in inflation, in food prices, in youth employment. And those numbers were telling a story even the skeptics couldn't ignore. So now the continent stands at a crossroads. Mali and Niger are poised to follow closely. Nigeria, if unburdened from political inertia, could leap further, and the smaller nations from Benin to Lesotho are watching, waiting, calculating. Because the spell is broken, the myth is gone. The IMF is no longer untouchable. And Burkina Faso, once dismissed as too poor to lead, has become a symbol of what leadership looks like when it stops begging and starts building. The revolution didn't come with chance or bayonets. It came in spreadsheets. It came in bond yields. It came in decimal points that refused to align with the story Western economists had told for generations. Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré didn't need to overthrow capitalism. It needed to correct its authorship. And so it did. What few thought possible, it replaced dependency with discipline. Let's speak plainly. The IMF had sold African nations a manual borrow cut subsidies. Sell your state assets, open your markets. Repeat. And if things go wrong, borrow again. But what happens when a country says no? Not with slogans, but with solvency? Burkina Faso's domestic bond program became more than financial reform. It became a moral pivot. It proved that even in a nation under pressure, a government that trusts its people and earns their trust in return can generate capital without ceding sovereignty. The results were staggering. Inflation dropped below 6%, shocking analysts who predicted double digits. The use of local currency in rural regions rose by over 40%, signaling trust in national systems. GDP growth, once flatlined, stabilized despite sanctions and global skepticism. Youth unemployment fell for the first time in over a decade, not through foreign job programs, but via public works funded by Burkinabe hands. And behind those numbers was something even rarer: dignity. Because this wasn't just about avoiding debt. It was about redefining what African strength looks like. For decades, the West has praised reformers, but only when those reforms came with approval stamps from foreign capitals. They applauded when African leaders sold off railroads and water rights. They cheered when school fees were hiked to meet loan conditions. They nodded politely as national currencies collapsed under imported inflation. But no one clapped when Burkina Faso balanced its books on its own terms. Why? Because Traoré didn't just show that Africa could be frugal, he showed that it could be free. In the boardrooms of Washington and Brussels, that was the real threat. And yet this model isn't built on miracles. It's built on memory. America should know this. After the Great Depression, the U.S. didn't cut its way out, it built its way out. With the New Deal, with public works, with trust in its people. During WB2, war bonds didn't just fund the fight, they created unity, pride, ownership. Burkina Faso followed the same logic. It didn't wait for perfect conditions. It created trust where there was none. It mobilized savings where there was fear. It built not just roads and schools, but confidence. And that's the part no algorithm can measure. The international lenders missed the human variable. They forgot that when people believe their money is building something real, they invest not just in bonds, but in hope. This is why the Burkina model cannot be exported like a spreadsheet. It has to be earned, with transparency, with restraint, with the humility to say, we made mistakes, but we won't make them with someone else's permission again. And now, from Jakarta to Johannesburg, small nations are reassessing their options. They see that freedom is no longer just about political speeches. It's about budgets. It's about who writes the loan terms and who lives under them. So what does this mean for Africa? It means that the future will be written in numbers, yes, but also in narratives, in the courage to say no, in the strategy to say yes to ourselves, in the ability to measure success, not by donor praise, but by mothers getting prenatal care, by teachers being paid on time, by youth building roads instead of fleeing across deserts. Burkina Faso didn't overthrow the old system. It outperformed it. And that, in the end, is what the IMF fears most. Not revolution, but results. If you ever marched in Selma, if you ever questioned Vietnam, if you ever asked what COINTELPRO was really about, then you understand something that Burkina Faso now lives. Freedom is never given, it's claimed. And today, in the heart of West Africa, a nation the world tried to forget just reminded us all that dignity can't be loaned, that sovereignty doesn't require permission, that leadership is not a performance, but a promise. Ibrahim Traoré didn't rise by asking how to fit into the system. He asked how to outgrow it. He showed that a government can answer to its people, not to creditors, that a young leader can speak softly and still shake empires, and that Africa's future won't be written in debt, but in decisions made on its own soil by its own citizens. So to our audience in Chicago, in Atlanta, in Detroit, we ask you, what would it mean to stand with those rewriting freedom? Not as theory, but as fiscal reality. This isn't just a Burkina Faso story. It's the story of every people who dared to say enough. If you still believe in justice, not just for one nation, but for all, share this story. Talk about it. Teach it. Let it travel. Because silence has never served the oppressed. And today, Africa is not asking, it's acting. Subscribe to Burkina Power not for charity, but for clarity. Because what began in Ouagadougou may yet remake the world.